We're ready to have the last afternoon session of our conference, and diverse are their hues. I just wanted to make one brief announcement, since I have a captive audience of people who are interested in Islamic art, to tell you that the next meeting of the Historians of Islamic Art Association in America, that's called HIA, will hold its second biennial symposium in 2010, October 21 to 23, so that's about a year from now, at the Freer Gallery and Sackler of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. The theme of the conference is Objects, Collections, and Cultures. The program will be announced in January, and for information, you can look on the web, www.historiansofislamicart.org, or you can speak to our new president, Mariana Shreve Simpson, who's with us here, and get more information from her. Other than that, I have no announcements. I just want to welcome Haley Sykes, who's going to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon. We'll have two speakers, and then we'll have today's panelists up here for a question and answer period this afternoon. Haley.
Dr. Bernard OKANE has been a central figure in the study of Islamic art since the early point of his professional career in the 1980s. As a renowned scholar, author, and professor, he has contributed greatly to the scholarship and pedagogy of Islamic art. The diversity of his publications, professional appointments, and body of research speak not only to his prolific interest in Islamic art, they also echo the divergent themes and myriad histories that are at the core of this fascinating subject. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. OKANE to the third biennial symposium and thank him sincerely for his dedication and insights.
Thank you for that introduction. My talk today is not exactly going to be the one that was advertised, which was the reasons why ateliers at kiln sites chose to specialize on architectural ceramics or on tableware. This is an interesting topic, but when writing it up, I found that in order to do it justice, I would need much more than the time allotted to us here. And I'm grateful to the organizers for allowing me to present a narrower, but not entirely unrelated focus on the development of new strategies for colour by tile workers in the 14th and 15th centuries. In particular, the rise of the type of overglaze painted tile work in the Eastern Iranian world, known as cuerda de seca, and its transfer to the Ottoman world in the 15th century. The Persian atelier working at first in Bursa, then Edirne and Istanbul has already been the subject of much research, but some aspects of it deserve further analysis. And along the way, I will present the results of some technical analyses which show why the cuerda seca technique as practiced by Iranian potters was much more successful than the overglaze menaillie which preceded it. It's been alleged in a recent article analysing the technical properties of Spanish cuerda seca, an example of which you see here, that the technique spread from Spain to Turkey, Central Asia, and India. But in fact, the analysis will show that the development of cuerda seca in these latter areas had very different technical properties from the earlier Spanish examples and were probably an independent development. A recent work on Iznik tiles has asserted that very little dry cord, which is the literal translation of cuerda seca, tile work of the quality of the Tabrizi atelier at Bursa is known from the Timurid realms further east. I hope, in fact, to show how much more widespread was cuerda seca in Iranian architecture of the 15th century than was previously thought. And finally, as tile work was the easiest way to obtain brilliant, glossy and long-lasting decoration on buildings, I can at least promise you a feast of colour. The term cuerda seca, translated in almost all of the English literature in the subject as dry cord, long puzzled me. How on earth could potters have used this dry cord when making a piece of pottery? Puzzled me at least until a couple of days ago when, fortunately, my colleague Antonio Fernandez Puertas was able to inform me that the correct translation in this context should be a colourless line. That makes an awful lot more sense than a dry cord. There have been analysis done of many of the early Spanish cuerda seca. On one sample from kilns in Zaragoza, they found that the black lines were composed of manganese and iron oxides. It's not clear from their analysis whether they might have been dissolved in an organic binder, such as oil or wax, or simply in water. The oil or wax, of course, would have burned off during firing and wouldn't have been apparent in any later analysis. Analysis of some other pieces showed the use of a high amount of tin in some of the black lines that might be linked to the role of tin in preventing the glaze from slipping over the cuerda seca line. The areas that I will be talking about mainly will be Samarkand, an acropolis there where the cuerda seca type in Iran began. The blue lines, in fact, don't show the spread of the technique. They are Timur's battle campaigns, but they still cover many of the areas that we will be looking at, around Herat and Khorasan, for instance, Tabriz further west, and then, of course, the Ottoman towns around what was then Constantinople, Istanbul, Edirne, and Bursa. This is a plausible candidate for the beginning of tile work in Iran. This is the dome chamber in the Friday Mosque at Natanz that has been analyzed by Sheila Blair, who gave us the date 999 for it. And you can see that there are some little hexagons of monochrome glazed turquoise tile within the loops of the arches and in a group of 3 at the corners. I mentioned this theory to the Iranian restorer of the site, and he, in fact, thought that this also was a later 14th century addition. But we do have much other 14th century tile work from this site, and it's much more extensive than this. These very small spots seem to me to present a very plausible candidate for the absolute beginnings of tile work in Iran. Another probably early example, also analyzed by Sheila Blair, is the minaret of the Friday Mosque in Dameran, which has a series of monochrome glazed molded tiles at the top. They now consist of a Quranic inscription that has been rather badly jumbled, but from the style of the kufik on them, it's probable that they date to around 1100. This, in fact, is one of the earliest examples of, possibly the earliest example of the use of an underglaze painted tile in Islamic architecture. This was found in some restorations or excavations that were being carried out at the Great Mosque of Raqqa in Syria. This monument was restored in 1156 by Nur ad-Din, and it's quite possible that these rather basic tiles in this underglaze painted technique may date from this period. And in fact, it's around this same period that we get for the first time underglaze painting used extensively on ceramics in pottery, in Syria in particular, in a variety of colors, blue, red, and black, underneath a colorless glaze. This is the first time it was used extensively, apart from the slip glazed pottery, of course, from earlier northeastern Iran. The Iranian response to this was the type of pottery that is known as minai, from the word enamel in Arabic. Pottery that was produced in 2 firings, an overglaze, with very fine painterly effects possible because of this. However, there's been some recent technical analysis of this pottery done, which has shown that the maturing temperatures for the paints were very similar to those of the underlying base glaze. Now, this is unlike contemporary glass enameling, where the glass had a softening temperature of around 850 centigrade and over 100 centigrade lower, 650 to 750 for the enamel paints. As far as this type of minai ware is concerned, the maturing temperatures that have been calculated for both the paints and glazes are typically in the range 890 to 920 centigrade. And so as a result, the exposure times for the paints would have been extremely short. So this unusual and risky nature of the minai technology explains the relative rarity of this kind of ware compared with other high technology pottery such as luster and underglaze painted wares. And it also explains why it was so short-lived. There are just a very few examples of it in tile work, for instance, none that have been left in any building, only in museum collections. One of the other early areas where experimentation in tile work was carried out was in Anatolia. And we're looking at the now destroyed kiosk or kushk that was beside the citadel in Konya. The exact date of this isn't sure. The range has been suggested roughly from about 1180 to 1220. But this is an example of the tile work that has been recovered from there, which at its center has a star in the Cuir de Seca technique, but surrounding it, it has the earliest examples of what we come to know later as la givardina, from, of course, the word for the lapis lazuli color that is used. And you have either this dark blue cobalt-based glaze, but maybe not, we'll get back to that later. Also turquoise-based glaze, on top of which you have overpainting in red, black, white, and sometimes gilding as well. So this is the earliest example of this technique, much earlier than, of course, any of the much more famous Ilkhanid pottery examples that we have. More early development of tile work in Anatolia is seen in the Dar es-Shafa, the hospital for the Anatolian Sultan Kaykaos, built in 1217. In addition to the simpler type of inlaid cut brick in the lower parts, we have a whole inscription in underglaze painted tiles above it of extremely fine quality. And there are also some very good examples of underglaze painted tiles in the cenotaphs that are within this mausoleum. There are the more usual colors of black, light blue, and dark blue visible here. But in one of the cenotaphs as well, we have the black, in fact, is diluted to produce a kind of purple shade made from manganese. So we have one of the very earliest examples of polychrome underglaze painting in the use of tiles. Another major center for new types of tiles was the early Iranian palace at Takht-i-Suleiman, dating from 1275. Exactly where the tiles were on the wall of this building, we're not too sure, but excavations have produced several different kinds. It's the first time, for instance, in Islamic art that we find the Chinese mythological figures of the phoenix, both in this and the dragon. Both of these are examples of this Lodge Vardina, where the overglaze painting in red, white, and instead of black, they're using gold outlining in this case on the dark blue cobalt ground. They used the same mold, in fact, for several different kinds of tile work. There are some luster tiles also of this shape known, and we also have an example here of an overglaze painted type on the turquoise background with much thicker use of the black in this case, and white, red, and gold still clearly visible on it. Moving to the early 14th century in Iran, we have several tiles that were recovered in excavations around the tomb of Ul-Jaytut Sultaniyya, and which, again, whose location on the building we don't know, we don't have precise information about, but they are of quite high quality. We have another overglaze painted tile on a turquoise base here. We also have some very fine underglaze painted tiles, slightly molded, as in this example. Here's a more detailed version of an overglaze painted tile, both on the turquoise glaze in the center and on the cobalt glaze around the outside, with the typical colors of white, red, black, and gilding. And then there's another very fine example of chinoiserie lotuses within polylobe medallions in underglaze painted cobalt. They haven't quite prevented the cobalt glaze from running under the transparent glaze in this case. This is a not terribly well-known building. It's the tomb of Mayana Baba, which is today in southeast Turkmenistan. It's the old town of Mehne, which was in Khorasan. It's a mausoleum which was probably built in the Seljuk period, but then restored in the Ilkhanid period in probably the 2nd or 3rd decade of the 14th century. So the tile work that you see in the center here is from the early 14th century. And this is mostly composed of cut tile work, tile mosaic, where they start off with square tiles, cut them and fit them together like pieces of a jigsaw pattern. But this was used at Sultaniyya before. Now they're trying to enliven it by incorporating both little bands of underglaze painted tiles. You see a detail of it here. But also, interestingly, in the main inscription, they have little roundels, which at first look simply like ochre pieces of tile mosaic, but when you look very closely at them, you can see they are, in fact, little medallions made of luster. Probably a very expensive and inconvenient way to add color to tile mosaic, which is why this was an experiment which essentially failed. We never hear of it again, unfortunately. After this, tile mosaic, in fact, did gain a variety of other colors, and that became one of the chief prestigious means of decoration. So I'm not going to talk about that much anymore. In Khwarezm, the area that was to the east of the Caspian Sea, there is a series of wonderful underglaze painted tiles, especially in cenotaphs, of which this in the tomb of Sayyid Alauddin Khiva is one of the very finest examples. The tomb of Najmuddin Kubra in Kohne or Gench, or Old Urgench, is another very interesting example. It has this fabulous tympanum. And at first stage, it's very hard to see just what shape the tiles are that make up this rather complicated tympanum. Perhaps if you look closely, you can see that, in fact, it's made up of hexagonal tiles. Now, it's very easy when you're doing a dado with stenciling to put the hexagonal tiles together. Doesn't matter which order they're in. Or in this dado represented in a painting from the great Mongol Shahnameh of about 1335, if they're surrounded by white lines as well, doesn't matter which order they're in. But the tile workers of the Najmuddin Kumra tympanum were extremely worried that the layers would get the order wrong. They were so worried, in fact, that they added a guide for them in the process of making the tiles, so that we have Aleph, Be, 1, 2, 3, 4, Te, Se, so both an alpha-numeric and an alphabetical system in order to make sure that, that they would be laid in exactly the right order. From this, at least, we can infer that the place where the tiles were made and the place where the tiles were being laid was probably separated to some large extent. We can probably also infer that lots of mistakes had been made previously in the past. This is one of the most magnificent pieces of tile work from the Shahi Zinda, the necropolis outside the town of Samarkand in northeastern Iran. And it comprises a variety of both overglaze and underglaze painted ceramics. We have overglaze painted ceramics unusually now on a white base instead of the dark blue or the turquoise that we have seen previously, in addition to some molded underglaze painted tiles. And varieties of these soon appear on the buildings in the Shahi Zinda. This isn't exactly dated. The room beside it is dated to 1334, but it could be up to a couple of decades later. But the same kinds of tiles appear in the Shadi Malik mausoleum, which is dated to 1371. I'm going to show you details of this area here, the facade and the inscription at the bottom left. The tympanum has both the Lajvardina, the overglaze painted tiles on the dark blue background, as well as fabulous underglaze painted tiles in chinoiserie motifs. Same underglaze painted on the left. And just make a quick note of this because we're going to see something similar to it later in Bursa as well. These are heavily molded tiles. which are then painted in different colors, and it's the molding that keeps the colors apart in this case. This is a small tile at the base of the entrance to the mausoleum, where we also have the white background that we saw in the cenotaph. Many of the tiles here have either dark blue or black lines surrounding them, some red. But it's on the interior of this where we have several large panels with circular medallions and hexagonal tiles surrounding them that we have for the first time what we could call the classical cuore secca, where all of the different colored compartments are surrounded by a dark black line. Although that this is the beginning of the series is perhaps evident from the way in which they haven't quite got perhaps the maturing temperature of the glazes correct, because they have run badly over the adjacent areas at some places. But they very quickly were able to deal with this and produce superb examples of this type in the Amir Zada mausoleum, for instance, or in an anonymous mausoleum of about the same type. And with the good graces of several people in different museums, Stefano Carboni and Oliver Watson, and the technical analysis staff, Mark Wopiski and Titan Salter at the Oxford Research Laboratory for Archaeology, I've been able to have a number of overglaze painted samples with red lines, with black lines, a couple here from the Eschelturba in Bursa, supposedly, and the overglaze painted type on the turquoise base analyzed for me. Now I'm just going to flash this up on the screen for a few seconds, secure in the knowledge that you'll be able to remember all of the figures. Well, it's just to show you that the research has actually been done in this, so rather than have me try and analyze it, let me quote the technical analysis of the Oxford Laboratory on this material. The areas of different colored glazes are separated by black or red lines produced from mineral slips rich respectively in manganese or iron oxides. The black or red slips in the colored glazes are usually applied onto a tin-opacified lead alkali-based glaze, in which case the lead oxide or alkali contents of the overglazes are normally higher than those of the base glazes. As a result, the maturing temperatures for the overglazes tended to be some 100 degrees centigrade lower than those of the base glazes, so that the overglazes could be produced in a second firing without the risk of damaging the base glaze. And they also point out in their analysis that the particulate nature of the red and black lines, they're made of small particles, they're not made of silica like other glazes. This was the main factor in helping them separate the adjacent colors. So where do we go from here? Well, I want to show you, in fact, just how many examples there are of these overglazed painted tiles in Timurid architecture in the late 14th and 15th century, to show you the possibility of the continuity between here and Bursa. So I'm just going to run over these very quickly. This is the tomb of Turebek Khanum in Kohneer Genç. It's been suggested by Lisa Gollenbeck that this is probably an early Timurid building. It's also a very interesting one because it has tiles that are both underglaze painted. You can see the running of the blue under the glaze, but these are also overglaze painted in green and red as well. This is an engaged column from the tomb of Khwaja Ahmed Yasavi, built by Timur in 1399 in Turkestan. This is his magnificent palace in Shahri Sabz, south of Samarkand, also finished in the late 14th centuries. And it actually has some interesting different strategies for the laying of tiles. For this inscription at the top, they laid them in rectangular tiles, but for the non-regular spandrel, they're back to using the hexagonal tiles that we had in the tympanum of Najmuddin Kubra. This is the great mosque of Timur in Samarkand, and this is a detail of these panels, extensive use of cuore secca overglaze. Here we see it now on a few buildings of Ulu Beg in Samarkand. This is his madrasa, dating from the 1420s. A little bit later, his mosque in Shahri-Sabz, the Kuk Sarai, and a building from the time of Ulu Beg in the Shahi Zinda dating from the 1420s, an anonymous mausoleum. Moving on to Herat under Shah Rukh, this probably is the only fragment that remains of what was an absolutely enormous inscription. The foundation inscription of this, the citadel in Herat, was in tile mosaic, so this can't have been the foundation inscription. We know that the court poet, Hafez Abru, or historian I should say, wrote a very long panegyric which he said was put on the walls of the citadel extolling the ruler and his family. And so it's probably all in this Cour de Seca technique. It was used also for the drum of the mausoleum of Gohar Shad, for one of the Iwans at Hargird, the mausoleum dating from the 1440s. Also from the 1440s, the tomb of a wife of Timur Tuman Agha at Khosan between Herat and Mashhad. And also roughly in the same area and the same time, the 1440s, the Firuz Shah Madrasa in Taibad. That's in Khorasan, but in fact there are also a few examples of it a little bit further west. This is the Imamzade Jafar at Damghan, a well-known early mausoleum, but just beside it on the right-hand side here, there's a building which has tile decoration over the entrance. It's an inscription in the name of Shah Rukh, commemorating the building of this Amara. It's known as a Khanka, but we don't know exactly what it was for sure. But some quite fine quality tiles then, both in the inscription and in the panel below it. A little bit further west again, this is the Friday Mosque in Semnan, which has an extensive inscription and some spandrels decorated in overglazed painted tilework. Not such high quality here for certainly the design of the inscription, although the spandrels are equally fine, I think. And this is a not terribly well-known building that is in Kashan in central Iran. It's undated, but judging from the overglazed painted tilework in the medallion on the ceiling, it almost certainly dates from around the same period. Now, the atelier in Bursa that we're going to see is signed the work of the Tabrizi masters. We don't know of any overglazed painted tiles from Tabriz at this period, but in the Blue Mosque we do have an amazing range of tilework. We have monochrome glaze stencil tiles on the left-hand side. We have luster tiles. This fragment I photographed in the 1970s. It's not there anymore. Just this little fragment is still left. We have underglazed painted tiles, small squares. We also have much larger, beautifully voluptuous, sensuous, three-dimensional arabesques made of underglazed painted tile. It even looks from this that the white arabesques are protruding on top of the dark blue, but that's an optical illusion. These tiles, or this fragment, is now in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So moving on to the examples in Bursa, this is the Yeshil Mosque and Turba seen from afar, the mosque on the right-hand side, the Turba on the left, and the famous signature of the workers, the Ustadan from Tabriz, which is on the mihrab. There are some other unusual features which just indicate perhaps the newness of this technique introduced into the area. If you're putting in an overglazed painted tilework medallion that is a circle, it's not obvious that you would divide it up in this rather peculiar and asymmetrical way. And in many of the medallions, we have this same asymmetrical feature. Moving on to the tomb here, it's one of the few examples where aspects of the architecture might even have been influenced from the Shahi Zinde. The ribbed semidome here is quite like an earlier tile mosaic one in the Shahi Zinde. I'm going to show you a detail now then of this area here. And another detail. This is an example of this what's called carved and glazed terracotta, or a heavily molded tile in which the molding helps prevent the colors slipping over one into the other. And this is the only example of experimentation in this style in Turkey. This is not seen hereafter. Inside the mausoleum we have more of the medallions. I'll show you a couple of these and some details from the mihrab as well. The medallions too also present the same very asymmetrical way of dividing up the overglazed painted tiles. This is slightly at a slant on the right-hand side. And at first glance, this seems perfectly regular. It is a superb example of design with this magnificent hanging lamp and two candlesticks with Chinese peonies on top of them. But when you look carefully, you'll see that, yes, they've done a fine job here, but oops, this just doesn't quite match up at this point. And then if you look at the lamp carefully, well, it's actually missing part of the left-hand side of the foot and the edge as well, so evidence of some inexperience. When the Tabrizi atelier moved on to Edirne, they started adding underglaze painted tiles extensively to the mosque. They're present on the dados that you see to the left and right. Here are some details. They used a lot of chinoiserie motifs in these also. And for the first time, they also used them on the mihrab of the building, in the hood. But there's also an interesting feature in the rectangular Moqarnas surround here. If you look carefully, you'll see that not only is the blue and white underglaze painted, but the yellow as well. And this is the first time that we see this occurring. There's another building in Edirne that the same team made in the Uç Mosque just a little bit later. This also has an unusual peculiarity. It's underglaze painted, but in 3 points, they missed the correct color for the border that was used in all of the other pieces. And this, of course, isn't a mistake of the people who laid the tiles. This was actually done where the tiles were made. I'm at a loss to explain this convincingly, but what we can perhaps deduce is that these were so valuable that they didn't want to waste the time and expertise to go back and do them over again in the correct color. They just had to make do with what they had here. And then we also see in the Fatih Mosque in Istanbul, dating from 1463, much more extensive use of underglaze painted yellow in addition to the other regular colors. The Iznik technique used to be thought perhaps to have been derived partially from the Tabrizi atelier, but in fact analysis by Julian Raby and Nur Hanatasoy has shown that there's a different chemical composition to them. But I think certainly one can claim that the work of the Tabrizi atelier in bringing these magnificent underglaze painted and overglaze painted tiles into the mosque fostered an appreciation for the role of tiles in mosques that must have encouraged the Iznik tile makers. And as a result, they made such masterpieces as these brilliant examples of design from the Rustam Pasha Mosque dating from 1561 in Istanbul. And here's a photograph of the mosque, and for a long, long time I used to tell my students this was one example where the great architect Sinan really slipped up. If you're going to have these very fancy tiles used extensively, you need to have some area to provide a contrast with them. And that you simply don't have in this mosque. Well, that's what I thought until I went back to the mosque some years later, and it's been transformed. They've removed the terrible, ugly 19th century painting, and the contrast that you need is now present. And I think this is a perfect example of what has been mentioned so often in this symposium, that there's no objective color to an item that you're looking at. You have to consider it in the context. So to summarize, the development of Khord Eseka in Iran is one of the techniques that evolved to bring polychrome tile work to buildings. It can be seen as resulting naturally from experimentation with earlier overglaze painted techniques, first Minai, but in particular La Givardina ware. It was developed first in the Shah's Indian necropolis at Samarkand and was later used extensively in eastern Iran in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Technical analysis has shown that the particulate nature of the black lines between the colours would in itself have helped maintain separation between the overpainted enamels. And so the greasy, waxy substance that, according to most accounts, accompanied them may never have been necessary. The analysis also explains why this technique had so much more success than the earlier Minai ware, as the second firing for the overglazed colours was at a much lower temperature than the first, leaving a correspondingly greater margin for error. From Samarkand, whether directly or via Iran is not clear, the technique also spread to Turkey, where, together with underglazed painted tiles, it stimulated Ottoman interest in the use of coloured tiles in interior decoration, an interest that culminated in the fabulous work of the independently founded Iznik ateliers. The 14th century was one of intense experimentation in tile work, and the Timurid Cour de Seca tiles of this and the following century, unlike the later Safavid ones that were a poor substitute for tile mosaic, deserve to enter the pantheon of luxury wares that made the tile work of this period so interesting and innovative. Thank you. Actually, maybe I can do something unorthodox here. Yeah. And instead of just asking for general questions, I had the very good fortune to be sitting at lunch beside Francesca Leone, who has a fascinating observation to make with regard to tiles. If she could stand up and if we could get the microphone to her. Francesca, yeah, if you'd stand up.
Thank you, Professor Okane. Yeah, we were discussing this aspect of the use of pigments in tiles, and there is so far this widespread and always attested conviction that the so-called Lajvardina ware is only using the term Lajvard, referring to the color blue, but not actually to the pigment of Sangi Lajvard, meaning the lapis lazuli, the lazurite. But it seems that the most recent analysis about fragments of so-called Lajvardina ware have actually attested the presence of lazurite in the interface between the base of the pot or the tile and the glaze applied on it. So it could be interesting to follow that development and understand whether that applies to all blue tiles or whether that applies only to the so-called tiles or pots following into the category, and whether that is a technological aspect that maybe comes through Asia after the Mongols, because there is an increasing presence and preference for blue hues right after the Ilkhanids. And so what I wanted to ask you is whether you noted any connection or any technological implication between the arrival of Mongols and a more widespread use of blue.
Well, that's what one would have thought initially, but in fact, having shown the Lajvardina ware that first occurs in the Seljuk kiosk in Konya, it seems that it's unlikely that this was the only example that was found, so there must in fact have been examples of it before the arrival of the Mongols into the Middle East. Certainly they patronized it. There are wonderful examples of it from the Takhti Suleiman Palace, and it became much more widespread under them, including pottery examples. We don't have any known pottery examples that were made in Anatolia. But it's a fascinating observation that the stone itself could have provided some extra enhancement of the color in these tiles, and it'll be wonderful to have some more technical analysis that could demonstrate this. Thank you very much for your observation.
And I think we're going to have to just have one or two more questions so we can move on. Another question? We completely sold them out, or they believe
Sounds
everything.
good.
Another
Thank
question?
you.
No? Okay, well then we thank you very much for your colorful romp through